biggest mistake you can make in life is to be continually fearing you will make one. Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I am Farah Moinian. I was touched by this quote because I will tell you in brief the story of how Gray Matters was born. It has been 17 long years since my older brother left us with this debilitating disease of schizophrenia. And for my sister Shirin, my beloved mother Raji, and my late father, our lives have not been the same. When Gray Matters was launched in London in 2005, my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and my mom could no longer continue the long and tedious work of running Gray Matters in London. So I took it upon myself to bring it to New York. Not knowing where I can take this mission and fearing of making a mistake, I froze. Do I believe in faith? One October morning in 2005, I opened the New York Times, and in the front page of the science section, I read, Dr. Lieberman, new chair of Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University, leading researcher on schizophrenia, said that, ... So when it took me 10 days to find you, Jeffrey, not only was I impressed by your looks, but by your demeanor. And please don't blush. You truly care about your patients, people so often forgotten in our society. Before I leave the podium, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Andrew Solomon in honoring us with his presence today. Thank you all for being here. I would never have done it without all of you, without my 5 committee members that we all started together, and for your belief in the cause and something that has touched me and so many of us. So I thank you, and I hope you enjoy your lunch.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Nice to be back here at the Plaza, right? Well, thank you for joining us today. My name is Donna Hanover, and it is wonderful to be with you for the 6th, count them 6th, annual Gray Matters at Columbia Spring Benefit Luncheon. And I'm delighted to see so many people from different walks of life in this room, although with the lights I can't actually see you. But we did greet each other outside. It's always a pleasure to see familiar faces at this event and to welcome those who are just joining us for the first time. I know that you are going to find this a unique opportunity to learn about the latest research at Columbia Psychiatry and to hear about how these scientific breakthroughs are leading to better and more effective treatment that is changing and saving countless lives. As many of you know, the Gray Matters at Columbia Spring Benefit Luncheon has proven to be an extremely successful occasion that offers a unique opportunity to learn about the latest medical research in brain disorders and psychiatric medicine taking place at Columbia Psychiatry. So you come here, you have a great lunch, you see your friends, you dress up a little bit, and you also learn something. It's a great twofer. For those of you who are new to the benefit, allow me to explain a little bit about it. Gray Matters at Columbia is a research fellowship fund within Columbia University Medical Center's Department of Psychiatry. Each year, the fellowship is awarded to young scientists who demonstrate extraordinary performance in the genetics of brain disorders. The fellowship helps attract the brightest young minds to psychiatry, which is extraordinarily important in a challenging economic environment, and given that there are so many worthy disciplines to pursue in the field of medicine. The Gray Matters at Columbia Fellowship also ensures that the next generation of psychiatrists will receive the best possible training and helps nurture the brightest young talent. For me, this is one of the most important things that happens in New York all year long. There's wonderful, wonderful occasions to support many different charities. But what we do here, helping these fellows, who, by the way, really are unbelievably brilliant, unbelievably smart, and who are going to change the world for all of us. What we're doing here today by helping Jeffrey to help them continue their work, it's really kind of astounding, and I feel very proud of all of us. One of the things I love about the event is that it gathers people together who are committed to supporting mental health research and offering hope to families facing everything from anxiety disorders to schizophrenia, Alzheimer's to autism and beyond. Now, I'd like to say a few words about our first speaker. He is someone who has a phenomenal academic and medical background, a physician scientist whose work is making an extraordinary difference in countless lives. Columbia's Department of Psychiatry is so lucky to have Jeffrey Lieberman as its chairman. He is a world-renowned expert in schizophrenia and psychosis. He also serves as the director of the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Additionally, Dr. Lieberman will be installed next month as the president of the American Psychiatric Association. Yeah. And I think that makes Rosemary, who is my longtime friend and a wonderful hostess and supporter of the work, Mrs. President of the American Psychiatric Association. Dr. Lieberman is a Distinguished Life Fellow of the APA. In his tripartite role as Institute Director, Department Chair, and Hospital Psychiatrist in Chief, he leads one of the largest and most highly acclaimed psychiatric departments in the country. Under his leadership, Columbia University's Department of Psychiatry has made the tremendous achievement of being ranked #1, numero uno, in research funding from the National Institutes of Health. Pretty awesome. But there is far more to Dr. Lieberman than his CV. He is a compassionate doctor who never loses sight of the people that he is helping. Now, it's possible, of course, when you're working hard on research, to be so focused on the numbers and the publishing that you forget that it's really about the people. Jeffrey never does. He sees each patient as an individual and gives them his utmost attention. He visits with them, laughs with them, checks in to make sure that they are feeling valued as people. A physician and scientist who has spent his career caring for patients and studying the nature and treatment of mental illness, Dr. Lieberman's own research has focused on the neurobiology, pharmacology, and treatment of schizophrenia and related psychotic disorders. His work has advanced our understanding of the mechanisms of action and effectiveness of antipsychotic drugs. He's played a pioneering role in demonstrating the importance of early detection and intervention for psychotic disorders, and served as principal investigator of the clinical antipsychotic trials of intervention effectiveness research program. Say that 5 times fast. That's the largest study ever sponsored by the National Institute of Mental Health. That tells you how significant it is. As for Jeffrey, I know there are people in this room who have reached out to him for advice and for help on an emergency basis when family members have faced confusing or even terrifying symptoms, and he is never too busy to provide guidance. Dr. Lieberman is truly a caring man as well as a spectacular doctor and investigator. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman.
Wow, what an introduction. Nobody can introduce somebody like Donna Hanover can. That's why we keep having her back year after year. Rosemary, just remember this for the next 364 days of the year. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Gray Matters at Columbia Luncheon. This has grown to be such a wonderful affair that after Rosemary's birthday and her wedding anniversary, it's my most favorite day of the year. And this is also the largest fundraising event that we hold each year for Columbia Psychiatry, and it's vital to our success. I've been telling people, I went to medical school to be a doctor. I trained in research to learn how to do, I trained in scientific research to be able to discover new knowledge about brain disorders. And in becoming a chairperson, I've had to also become an executive. And what we've learned is that the business model of academic medicine, which is the really most precious jewel in the crown of American industry and services, is in jeopardy. And it's through the process of being able to avail ourselves of the generosity of interested citizens, patients, family members, that we've been able to sustain this excellence. And for us at Columbia Psychiatry, the Gray Matters Luncheon is really the cornerstone of our philanthropic and our fundraising efforts. It's vital to our success. Given the current economic situation that we're in, the dysfunction of our healthcare financing system, I really don't know what we would do if we didn't have this kind of generous support. So I'm deeply grateful and thank you from the bottom of my heart. As Donna said, this is the 6th year of this event, and each has been organized by a dedicated group of people to whom I'm deeply grateful. And this group, which is the committee and the people that have been instrumental in organizing the event and reaching out to friends to participate, I know that you know who you are sitting out there. I want you to know how appreciative I am of what you do and what a good cause you're supporting. It's because of these tireless efforts that this event each year has become bigger and more successful. The events are so well planned and entertaining that they seem to flow effortlessly. But the reality is they all require very hard work. It's not easy getting people to come. It's not easy getting people who have multiple opportunities to attend fundraising events and support worthy causes, and in many cases, less worthy causes. But we've been able to fill this room for the last several years, and it grows each year, and we have to decide, do we go to a bigger room or do we keep it in a venue like this, which has been so intimate and enjoyable. It's truly a team effort. This event is not underwritten by a single person, but rather it's a group of dedicated people who support and organize this annually. But having said that, I do want to point out one person. I want to mention her because of her exemplary leadership and the fact that she takes a load off my mind by being the first each year to sort of step forward and go, okay, I'm going to lead the way. I'm going to contribute to support the next year's luncheon. Since its inception, Dr. Patricia Kane has always been the first person to send a check to support Gray Matters. She sends a check, she buys a table, and then she's also there to provide additional support when it's needed. The first year that we had this lunch, 75 people came to the Rainbow Room, and Pat was there. And afterwards, she said, okay, we're going to do this again next year, and she really led the way by making the first contribution to support this. The next day, she even brought the check to our home, saying, you got to get on this stick, don't rest on your laurels. Pat is what they call a stand-up woman, not to mention the fact that she's a trained neuropsychologist. So Pat, please stand up and just let people look at you. I also want to acknowledge our corporate partners who are very dear and important to us. Forest Laboratories and Novartis are our corporate sponsors for this event today. And Synovian is a corporate supporter of today's event. And also, I want to recognize the many special contributors who are listed in your program who have made today's event possible. Now, each year, we honor a distinguished guest. We don't honor somebody who's going to fill the room with their friends who feel like they need to show up and buy a table to support them. We honor somebody who's been a significant figure for the public, for public health, and some relation to brain disorders and mental health care. In the past, these have included Jane Pauley, Dick Cavett, Paula Zahn, Ann Ford, Patrick Kennedy. Last year, we had Gwyneth Paltrow. And this year, we recognize a dear friend and colleague, Andrew Solomon, who with the publication of his new book, Far From the Tree, is appropriately being recognized as a towering and original talent with a unique voice in American letters. His book has already won the National Book Award for Nonfiction, and in my humble opinion, should be a very strong candidate for a Pulitzer Prize. I know Andrew from my mouth to God's ears. For those of you who have not yet heard Andrew before, you should know that he speaks as beautifully as he writes, so you're in for a real treat. Now, as Donna mentioned, we take great pride, justifiably, in that fact that Columbia is the largest and the leading department of psychiatry in the country. We are wholly dedicated to our mission, which is to find the causes and cures of mental illness and to provide the best treatment which is scientifically possible to people in need. Unfortunately, due to limitations in funding and resources, in the bureaucracy of our healthcare financing system, and most importantly for psychiatry, the stigma and lack of awareness, we're not always successful. I want to share with you a story, a true story, about such a case in which we were not able to help in time. And I'm able to share this with you because of one man's courage in being willing to have people learn from his experience in the hopes that it'll prevent something like that from happening to them. About 6 months ago, I received a call from the dean of the Columbia Law School asking if I could help provide treatment for a faculty member's wife. I said, of course, and I subsequently spoke to the faculty member, Professor Curtis Milhaupt, who told me of his concern about his wife, Terry. Terry Milhaupt was a highly respected scholar in the art world and an expert in Asian art and particularly in Japanese textiles. She was also a devoted mother to her son, a beloved wife, and a more warm and generous person whose friendships extended across cultures and continents. She was described by friends and colleagues as having a palpable joie de vivre. However, some years earlier, Terry had experienced a severe postpartum depression. She recovered and was well for years, but her depression returned. Ironically, just when she was offered a prestigious job as a curator in Asian art at the Metropolitan Museum. Despite beginning to get treatment and being surrounded by a loving family and supported by a host of dear friends, Terry was suffering terribly. That was when the dean contacted me on their behalf. However, soon after my conversation with Curtis, before we could do anything to help, Terry took her own life. In the aftermath of such a shocking loss, we all try to imagine what might have gone differently. Although we'll never know exactly what was in Terry's mind and what led to her actions in the moments before she died, we believe that she must have been suffering terribly to give up such a full and rich life. I wonder, however, if the pervasive stigma that unfortunately still exists about mental illness made it much harder for her to reveal the true extent of her suffering to those who loved her and even to those who may have been trying to treat her. And I also wonder why people have to suffer and wait so long before they can find good treatment. Terry's loss shows so powerfully the need for better access to mental health care, as well as for research into the causes and the development of better treatments for mental illness. Those of you who are here will remember that last year's theme for the luncheon was women's mental health, and it featured Gwyneth Paltrow's moving account of her own experience with depression, as well as highlighting our newly established Women's Mental Health Service, which we launched at Columbia under the direction of Dr. Elizabeth Fiddleson to serve this critical yet unmet public health need. The response to the service has been overwhelming. Betsy and her colleagues received referrals not just from the doctors in the OBGYN department, but from all medical specialties in the hospital. And the program's faculty are on the cutting edge of research in all areas, including the way in which depression in mothers affects their children and how to prevent this. As painful as this event was to Terry's husband, he chose to speak out publicly rather than to hide her story and grief, and is establishing a memorial fund in her name to support women's mental health. And I'm so pleased that we've invited, and he's accepted, that Curtis Milhaupt is with us today, and would like to acknowledge and thank Curtis for his courage, for his humanity, in being so open about the experience that he's had and trying to develop this fund. Now, the whole point of this luncheon and the funds that are raised from it is really to support the people who are going to generate the new knowledge which will lead to the alleviation of the suffering from mental illness. These are the hopes for the future, and these are not pie-in-the-sky hopes. These are realistic hopes that will happen within our lifetimes. The key to success in research is getting the best talent, the smartest people to focus on this and make this their life's work, and to give them the resources they need to do their thing. At Columbia, we get tremendous talent, as Donna mentioned to you. We develop this precious resource into world-class scientists. The great comedian, for those of us who will remember him, Eddie Cantor, said, "It takes 20 years to make an overnight success." And the same is true for making great scientists. A budding scientist goes to college, then they go to medical school, then they do their clinical training in a residency program, then they take additional training in a research fellowship, and then they work with a mentor to develop a body of work that enables them to pursue independent scientific research. Only then are they capable of branching out on their own. This fundraiser today is dedicated to supporting the development of this young talent whose goal is to discover these causes and cures for these disorders. We have here in the room today a number of our distinguished faculty, as well as many of our trainees, including past and current Gray Matters Fellows. I'd like to particularly acknowledge the current Gray Matters Fellows, whose pictures should appear on the screen, who are Amir Levine, Sandra Marks, Rachel Marsh, and also Holly Moore, whose lab has been supported by a grant from the Sidney R. Bear Foundation, which has joined with the Gray Matters event to provide funds for this purpose. Now, last year, for those of you who were there, remember, in addition to Gwyneth Paltrow's account, we had a very moving and informative presentation by one of our faculty, Blair Simpson. Blair is a product of this educational process that I described to you. She's emerged as a leading researcher in the United States and one of the luminaries in psychiatric medicine. Now, I would like to tell you about this year's speaker by way of introducing her, who is one of Blair's proteges and a former Gray Matter Fellow. So you see how this cycle of support has brought somebody to maturation in the time span that this event has been ongoing. Carolyn Rodriguez was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico. She went to Harvard College and then to Harvard Medical School. While there, she also obtained a Ph.D. in neurobiology. She then came to Columbia for her training in clinical psychiatry. And after finishing, she was involved in a research fellowship. With the support of Gray Matters, she continued beyond her fellowship to work under Blair's mentorship and developed an extraordinary line of research into the basis, the pathological basis in the treatments for obsessive compulsive disorders and the newly identified group of hoarding disorders. I should also add that in the midst of her training, Carolyn got married. She had 3 children and managed to manage the challenges of family and professional life brilliantly. I think it's fair to say that Carolyn is one person who probably does not need to read Sheryl Sandberg's new book, Lean In. So in a way, this is, and there's no place that's more fitting than the Gray Matters at Columbia Luncheon. This is Carolyn's scientific coming out party, where she's introduced to society as an independent investigator. So please join me in welcoming our faculty speaker for today, Dr. Carolyn Rodriguez.
Bring it down. Good afternoon. My name is Carolyn Rodriguez, and I'm an assistant professor at Columbia. My research goal is to link the basic biology of the brain to the development of new treatments for patients. Gray Matters at Columbia Early Career Fellowship has been critical to the two projects that I'll tell you about today. The first focuses on alleviating symptoms in patients with severe obsessive-compulsive disorder, also called OCD, with rapid-acting medications. And the second project focuses on developing new treatments for individuals with hoarding disorder. First, let me tell you about OCD. It is characterized by repetitive intrusive thoughts that cause anxiety, called obsessions, and repetitive rituals called compulsions. In addition to these outward symptoms, patients also have intense private suffering that is debilitating in their daily lives. For example, one of my patients, whom I have disguised to protect her privacy, is a talented young woman, a high school math teacher, and she gets stuck arranging and checking to make sure everything is symmetrical for 3 to 4 hours a day. She gets stuck preparing her son's breakfast. She gets stuck brushing her hair. And most painful to her, she gets stuck at the end of the workday in her classroom, unable to stop her OCD and to be able to get home to her family. Our frustration as clinicians is that current treatments for OCD take a long time, 2 to 3 months, to reduce symptoms. And even then, roughly half of patients will only have minor reductions in their symptoms. Imagine taking your brother to the doctor after he has fallen and broken his wrist, and having the doctor tell you that your brother will need to take a pill for 8 to 10 weeks, and if he's lucky, the pain will slightly lessen. This is not acceptable, and yet this is what I have to tell my OCD patients. We need better and faster acting treatments for OCD. My current research involves glutamate, the main neurotransmitter that is involved in the communication between nerve cells in the brain. There is increasing evidence that glutamate plays a role in OCD symptoms. Ketamine is a drug that changes levels of glutamate in the brain. Gray Matter sponsored the first clinical trial of ketamine, given IV or intravenously, in a group of my patients that had constant obsessions. The high school teacher I described volunteered to participate in this study. She responded to the infusion of ketamine, telling me, "I feel as if the weight of OCD has been lifted. I want to feel this way forever." Indeed, looking at all the people who participated in the study together, we found a single dose of ketamine caused immediate and complete cessation of obsessive symptoms in half of individuals. In some, this effect persisted for up to 1 week. My patients and I were encouraged that they could have a vacation of sorts from their OCD. Our next step is to figure out how to get the effects of ketamine to last. We also want to develop ways to give ketamine in a more accessible manner. For example, ketamine is currently used in pain clinics as an intranasal spray. We want to see if we can use ketamine intranasally for OCD. The idea is, like my son, who has asthma, after 2 quick puffs of albuterol, he immediately feels better and can go outside and play with his friends. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could use a device for the teacher stuck in her classroom that she can give to herself intranasally, break the OCD cycle, and go home to enjoy that precious time with her family? Another question I'd like to answer: how does ketamine affect the brain and reduce symptoms? Thus, our next step is to repeat the study in a larger group of patients and add brain scans during the infusion of ketamine to see where glutamate is changing in the brain to be able to locate the brain pathway responsible. My second research project is focused on hoarding disorder, which used to be considered part of OCD, yet is now considered a distinct entity. You may have read in the newspapers or seen on television individuals who have severe difficulty discarding possessions, leading them to barely be able to open their front doors wide enough to enter their homes. Hoarding has a tremendous public health impact and safety impact for individuals, their neighbors, landlords, community agencies, and ultimately can lead to eviction. Although some treatments for hoarding exist, one of our biggest challenges is that individuals with hoarding disorder often do not seek help, and it comes at a great price. For example, one of my patients, who again is disguised, who is an emergency room nurse, who led me through a narrow corridor of possessions that reaches about shoulder height, described the crushing guilt she felt raising her only daughter in these suffocating and hazardous conditions. Only an eviction notice and the crisis of losing everything she owned motivated her to seek help. My current research project connects individuals facing the crisis of eviction with a one-on-one specialist who can connect them to mental health, legal, and skill-based group treatments. After 2 months, with the help of our team and her family, she herself has begun to clear her apartment of excessive possession and is, for the first time, optimistic about her chances. I would also like to answer the question, what is the brain process that causes individuals with hoarding to be so reluctant to part with their possessions? Then I'd like to develop treatments that can alter these brain circuits to help these patients. Great Matters at Columbia Fellowship has been critical for the launch of these 2 projects that are focused on developing better treatments for these 2 severe disorders. Before I end, I want to talk to you about how the Great Matters at Columbia group has been very meaningful to me beyond the research support. I first attended the Great Matters Luncheon as a psychiatry resident 5 years ago in the Rainbow Room on top of the Rockefeller Center. And I remember at the time being incredibly sleep deprived, having just returned to work after maternity leave with my first son and wondering how I was going to be able to manage the start of my postdoctoral fellowship. And then I heard Farah, Moinian, as you heard today, speak courageously about her family's story and what her sister Sharon and her mother, along with the Benefit Committee and Jeff and Rosemary Lieberman, were doing to help others through Great Matters. I was drawn to her message of hope, as well as to the commitment and drive of the women I was sitting with at lunch. I left energized and eager to get back planning my fellowship research projects. I also want to highlight my outstanding research mentor, Dr. Blair Simpson. If you wouldn't mind, Blair, could you stand and wave? I know where you are. Thank you. She was the faculty speaker last year, as you heard Jeff say, and not only has she been a stellar scientific guide, but also a role model as a clinical researcher who is focused on helping our patients. We need more mentors like her to help move the exciting discoveries in basic science at the level of the molecule and cell to test how they can be relevant for treatments for patients who are suffering right now. Thank you so much, Blair. Blair and I also want to thank Dr. Lieberman, our chairman, who has supported me since I was a resident here in the program, in keeping with the extraordinary support he has for early career researchers. Finally, I want to thank Great Matters at Columbia Committee and all the supporters here today for their contribution to Dr. Lieberman's vision. It is an exciting moment in psychiatry, and for Columbia and Great Matters to be working together to produce cutting-edge treatments to provide relief to individuals with mental illnesses and ultimately relief to their families. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez. I know I speak for everyone that it is fascinating and encouraging to hear the specifics of what you're working on and the people that you've been able to help. And with regard to the hoarding issue, I'm not going to let you into my shoe closet. I'm just not going to do it. It is really a pleasure to put faces on this great department's mission. So truly, Dr. Lieberman's unwavering support for young researchers like Dr. Rodriguez is a testament to his vision for this field and the great strides in mental health care that Columbia is leading. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our honoree. All of us are so pleased that he could be with us today. Andrew Solomon is a National Book Award-winning author whose latest book, Far from the Tree, shares the stories of families raising exceptional children. It has received all sorts of well-deserved accolades and honors, including the National Book Critics Circle Award. In addition to being a brilliant author, Andrew is also a dear friend of Columbia University Medical Center and Columbia Psychiatry, as he dedicates his time and efforts as a board member of both organizations. And also, I do want to say that I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to look at Far from the Tree, but it is a seminal work. It is really an extraordinary piece of scholarship in addition to a wonderful book to be able to pick up at Barnes & Noble. And it's very engrossing, and it's the story of families that are raising children who fell far from the tree, who are unlike their parents for different kinds of reasons. And I presume that Andrew's going to tell you about this. But the families that are raising children that have dwarfism, that have become criminals, that are the children of rape, just very, very complex kinds of parenting challenges. And what I loved was that he was recently quoted in one of the newspapers as saying that when he became friends, and he truly became friends with these families, they really totally gave him access so that he could really find out what their lives was like. He said that you might have expected some of these families to be bitter, but he said for the most part, they ended up grateful for experiences that they would have done anything to avoid. So I'm very, very interested, as are you, I'm sure, to hear what he has to say. We salute his remarkable work and would like to present him with a small memento of our gratitude and welcome him to the stage. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Solomon.
A blue box. How exciting. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, exactly. Well, first of all, I'd like to say what a huge honor it is to be at this particular event. Jeff has become a great friend, but I admire his work enormously. He has helped to refer doctors for any number of friends of mine who have been going through difficult times in various places all over this country and all over the world. I've had a chance to witness the extraordinary burgeoning of research at Columbia, and I feel deeply lucky and privileged to count Jeff as a friend. And I think this event in raising funds also raises consciousness and also helps to reduce the feeling of stigma that blocks so many people from getting access to the care that they deserve. So I'd just like to say that in tribute to Jeff Lieberman. And also I'd like to say a word in praise of the committee, whom I thank, and especially of my sister-in-law, Sarah Long Solomon, who's been very much involved in this process. Even in purely non-religious terms, homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life. As such, it deserves no glamorization, no rationalization, no sophistry about simple differences in taste, and above all, no pretense that it is anything but a pernicious sickness. That's Time magazine in 1966, when I was 3 years old. And last year, the President of the United States came out in support of gay marriage. And I was left to wonder how we got here from there. I was left to wonder how an illness became an identity and what the meaning of that shift and change might be. When I was about 6 years old, I went with my mother and my brother to a shoe store, Indian Walk Shoes on Madison Avenue. Some of you may remember it. And when we got finished getting our shoes, the salesman said that each of us could have a balloon. And my brother wanted a red balloon, and I wanted a pink balloon. And my mother suggested that I might actually prefer a blue balloon. And I said, no, I really wanted the pink balloon, and she reminded me that blue was my favorite color. The fact that blue now is my favorite color, but I'm still gay, is evidence, I think, of both my mother's influence and its limits. When I was growing up, she used to say from time to time, "The love you have for your children is like no other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it's like." And when I was little, I took that as the greatest possible compliment. It meant that raising my brother and me was her great joy. And when I was an adolescent, I thought, but I'm gay and I may not ever be able to have children. And she went on saying it, and it made me anxious. And when I finally came out of the closet and she said it, it made me furious. I said, that's not the path I'm on, that's not what I'm doing, and I want you to stop saying that. About 20 years ago, my editors at the New York Times Magazine asked me to write a piece about deaf culture. And I was rather taken aback at the time because I didn't know that deafness was a culture. I thought it was a disability, pure and simple. Those people who couldn't hear, what a shame for them. And then I went out into the deaf world. I went to deaf clubs. I went to see deaf theater. I saw performances of deaf poetry. I even went to the Miss Deaf America contest in Nashville, Tennessee, where people complained about that blurry Southern signing. And the conclusion that I came to was that deafness is a culture. It's not my culture, and though I found it very attractive, I didn't want to give up the identities I have in favor of that one, but it has just as much a claim to being a culture as Latino culture, or Jewish culture, or perhaps even American culture. And then I discovered that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, and that those children often discover the deaf culture only in adolescence, after a childhood in which they've been pressed to function in the hearing world, and that it can come as a great liberation for them when they finally stumble into it. And I thought how similar it was to the gay experience when gay children are born to straight parents, and those straight parents often want to make them function in what they see as the mainstream and real world. And eventually, the children discover what it is to be gay from a community around them. And then a friend of mine had a daughter who was a dwarf, and she began talking about all of the questions she faced. Should she tell her daughter she was just like everyone else but rather short? Or should she tell her daughter that she should become involved with the little people of America and somehow be constructing a dwarf identity? And as she narrated her bafflement, I thought this is a pattern that I'm encountering of families who perceive themselves to be essentially normal, who have children who are in some profound way different. And I ultimately came up with the idea that there are two kinds of identity. There are vertical identities that are passed down generationally, parent to child to the next generation, your ethnicity, your nationality in most cases, your language almost always, your religion frequently. These are all things that parents have in common with their children. And while there are vertical identities which are very difficult, nobody has attempted to cure them and make them go away. You could argue that in America, as it's currently constructed, it's harder to be a person of color than to be white. But nobody is trying to find technology that will allow the next generation of children born to African American or Asian parents to come out with creamy skin and blonde hair. The other kind of identity is a horizontal identity. It's something that one discovers from one's peer group, like deafness, like dwarfism, like gayness. I went on to investigate many of these categories as I wrote the book. And those are identities you do not have in common with your parents. And the tradition, time out of mind, has been to try to cure or resolve those identities. A lot of the people I met who had horizontal identities had very difficult relationships with parents who they felt had not been loving when they encountered the quality that those children had. And I, over time, came to think that there are two operative forces between a parent and a child. One is love, and the other is acceptance. And sometimes the deficit in acceptance feels like a deficit in love, but that isn't what it is. I was angry that my parents didn't instantly jump on board with every aspect of my being gay, but there's no question that they loved me the whole time. There's no question that all it was acceptance, and that acceptance takes time. Acceptance almost always takes time in dealing with these identities. In order to have a real sense of any identity being accepted as an identity, it needs to function at three levels. There needs to be self-acceptance, there needs to be family acceptance, and there needs to be social acceptance. And for me, the social acceptance is often a function of what the families do. The self-acceptance is related to what families do. And so I made families my area of inquiry. I'll tell you about one of the dwarfs I got to know. His name is Clinton Brown. And he was born with diastrophic dwarfism, which is a terribly disabling condition. And the doctors at the hospital said to his mother that he was never going to learn to walk or talk, would never recognize them, and should be left at the hospital to die quietly. And she said, no, I'm going to take my child home. She didn't have huge resources, either educational or financial. She worked in a call center, but she managed to find her way to Johns Hopkins, where the doctor who did the best treatment for that condition was then based. And in the course of his childhood, Clinton had 30 surgeries, major surgeries, as a result of which he is in fact able to walk. And while he was having all of these surgeries and was stuck in the hospital for long periods of time, he decided, as he had nothing else to do, that he would focus on his schoolwork. And so he focused on it, and he excelled, and he graduated high school with honors, and he was the first person in his family to go to college. And he went to college not far from where his parents live on Long Island, and he lived on campus, and he drove a specially fitted car that accommodated his diminutive size. And his mother told me that one day she was driving home, and she saw the car, the very recognizable car, in the parking lot of a bar. And she said, I thought to myself, what is going on here? 2 beers, they're 6 feet tall, he's 3 feet tall. 2 beers for them is 4 beers for him. She said, I knew I couldn't just walk in there and tell him to leave, but I went home and I left him 8 messages on his cell phone. She said, and then I thought, if someone had told me when he was born that my future worry would be that he'd go out drinking and driving with his college buddies, I'd have been so glad to have that problem. And I asked her what she had done that had allowed Clinton to emerge as a charming, delightful, accomplished person. And she said, what did I do? I loved him, that's all. Clinton just always had that light in him. And I was lucky enough to be the first to see it there. I'm going to quote you from one other magazine. This is the Atlantic Monthly in 1969. There is no reason to feel guilty about putting a Down syndrome child away, whether it is put away in the sense of hidden in a sanatorium or in a more responsible, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from an offense against a person, and a Downs is not a person. There's been a lot of news about our changing attitude toward gayness. Indeed, it's on the front page of the paper almost every day that we've made a huge shift there. We forget how much of a shift there's been in the world of disability and how much valiant work disabled people have done to bring about that shift. One of the families I interviewed, Tom and Karen Robards, had a son with Down syndrome. They were shocked when it happened. They were hard-charging Wall Street types, busy, accomplished, and young. They had no reason to expect anything would be wrong. And after their son was born, they started looking at the educational possibilities for him, and they thought that everything seemed very disappointing. So they helped to found, in 2 small classrooms, something called the Cook Center with some other parents to provide better educational opportunities. And over the years, the Cook Center grew, and it's now educated untold thousands of children with intellectual disabilities of every kind. And I said to them, this has been your life's work. I said, do you regret it? Do you wish your son didn't have Down syndrome? Would you like to make it go away? And his father said, well, for David, our son, I regret it. And for David, our son, I would make it go away because it's made his life difficult, and I'd like to give him an easier life. But I think it would be a loss to all of us if it were to disappear. And his mother said, I'm with Tom. She said, if I could make it go away, I would do so for my son. But speaking for myself, well, I would never have believed 23 years ago when he was born that I could come to such a point. It's given us so much richer a life. It's made me so much better a person than I would ever have been without it. That speaking for myself, I wouldn't give it up for anything in the world. We live in this moment of these enormous breakthroughs in social acceptance, which happens to coincide with enormous medical breakthroughs that may eliminate these populations just as they arrive at acceptance. Cochlear implants are given to an increasingly large number of deaf children. The effect of the implants is to make them functionally hearing. A new compound, BMN 111, has been shown in mice to block the action of the gene that causes achondroplasia, which is the most common form of dwarfism. It's starting testing in human beings. And blood tests to establish whether a fetus has Down syndrome much earlier in a pregnancy than has been possible up until now are currently being finished so that they can be brought to market. I sometimes feel as though it's like one of those opera plots in which the hero realizes he loves the heroine just at the moment that she lies expiring on the sofa. I believe in both the social and the medical progress. I think they're both important. I think they're both urgent. But I think people in either camp sometimes fail to realize the ways in which each of them could learn from the others. And this question of cure remains a haunting one. Jim Sinclair, an adult with autism, said, "When parents say, 'I wish my child did not have autism,' what they're really saying is, 'I wish the autistic child I have did not exist, and I had a different, non-autistic child again.'" Read that again. This is what we hear when you mourn over our existence. This is what we hear when you pray for a cure. That your fondest hope and dream for us is that someday we will cease to be, and strangers you can love will move in behind our faces. Autism describes a very broad range of symptoms and experiences, and there's no question that that's an extreme point of view. It's difficult to reconcile what an activist like that has said with the experience of a child sitting in the corner of a room with no language, banging his head against the wall and injuring himself. Nonetheless, that question of what should be cured or not cured haunts us. Tom and Sue Klebold are the parents of Dylan Klebold, who is one of the perpetrators of the Columbine massacre. And when I finished interviewing them the first weekend we spent together, we'd spent ages negotiating for me to come there at all. We spent a long time talking to each other. They were full of their story, and on Sunday night, exhausted, we were sitting at the kitchen table, and I said, "If Dylan were here now, is there anything that you'd want to ask him?" And his father said, "There sure is. I'd want to ask him what the hell he was doing." And Sue looked at the floor, and she thought for a minute, and then she said, "I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head." A few years later, she and I were having dinner, and she said, "When it first happened, I used to wish that I had never married. If I hadn't gone to Ohio State and hadn't crossed paths with Tom, these children wouldn't have existed, and this terrible thing wouldn't have happened. But over time, I've come to feel that I love the children I had so much that I don't want to imagine a life without them. Dylan brought me a lot of pain, but life is full of suffering, and this is mine. When I say that, I speak of my own pain and not the pain of other people." She said, "But while I recognize that it would have been better for the world if Dylan had never been born, I've concluded that it would not have been better for me." I was amazed by how often I encountered this description of people holding on to their children, and yet it seemed to me that it's actually the universal experience of parenting, which is that you have children who are flawed or difficult or just bewildering. I have yet to meet a parent who has not at some point looked at his child and said, "Where did you come from?" And while I thought it seemed extraordinary, all of these parents so attached to children who were so problematical, I thought how if some glorious angel came through my living room ceiling and offered to take away the children I have and to replace them with other, better, smarter, more attractive children, I would pray away that atrocious spectacle. The children we have become our destiny. One mother whose very severely disabled child had died through caretaker neglect said when she interred his ashes, "Let me bury here the rage I feel to have been twice robbed, once of the child I wanted, and once of the son I loved." The differences that I'm describing individually feel very isolating. There are only so many people dealing with schizophrenia or autism or Down syndrome or criminality. There are only so many families with a child who's transgender. But if one recognizes that the experience of negotiating difference is essentially a universal experience, then one can suddenly see that the differences we have are in fact what unites us, that the experience of negotiating difference is the thing we most have in common as families. I decided to have children while I was working on this book. And many people asked me how I could have the courage to do so in the midst of examining everything that can go wrong. And I said I wasn't examining everything that can go wrong. I was examining how much love there can be even when everything goes wrong. So my husband is the biological father of 2 children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. I have a daughter with one of my closest friends from college who had gotten divorced and then wanted to have a child, and mother and daughter live in Texas. And my husband and I have a son of whom I am the biological father, and our surrogate for the pregnancy was the lesbian in Minneapolis who is the mother of John's biological children. My shorthand for the arrangement is 5 parents of 4 children in 3 states. And there are people out there who somehow think that the existence of my family threatens their families, that families like mine are damaging the institution of family. But I don't accept subtractive models of love, only additive ones. And I believe that in the same way that we need species diversity to sustain the planet, so in that same sense, we need this diversity of affection and family structure to sustain the ecosphere of kindness. The day our son was born was a joyful one, and the next morning the pediatrician came in and said that he was not extending his legs correctly, and that she thought that might indicate that he had brain or neurological damage. And then she said that insofar as he was extending them, he was doing so asymmetrically, and that might reflect a mass or tumor in his brain. And she commented that his head was very large and that we should check for hydrocephalus. And I felt the whole center of my being drop out of me and spill onto the floor. And I thought, it's so unbelievably horrifying, and it's so strange to think that in the midst of writing a book about these things, I should suddenly find myself in this situation. But nature is, of course, no stranger to irony. And so we went off for hours and hours of tests and had our tiny newborn wedged into a CAT scanner and wedged into an MRI machine and had arterial blood draws and were there having a terrifying experience. And I thought to myself, my experience of this, my feelings of despair, are because this is an illness. And like all parents since the dawn of time, I want to protect my child from illness. But I also knew that if he did have any of the things we were testing for, that would be his identity. And if it was his identity, it would be my identity, and that it would be my job with my husband to build that identity into one that we were able to accept, perhaps even to celebrate. At the end of 5 hours, they said that he was really perfectly fine, and by then he was extending his legs correctly. And the pediatrician suggested that he might have had a cramp. But I thought to myself that my mother had been right, that the love you have for your children is like no other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. Children had ensnared me, I think, the moment I connected fatherhood with loss, but I probably wouldn't have noticed that if I hadn't been engaged in this research. Encountering so much strange love, I had fallen without even noticing it into its bewitching patterns and seen how splendor can illuminate even the most abject vulnerabilities. I had witnessed and learned the terrifying joy of unbearable responsibility. I had seen how it conquers everything else. And though sometimes I thought the parents I was interviewing were fools, enslaving themselves to a lifetime's journey with their thankless children, I realized that my research had built me a plank and that I was ready to join them on their ship. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, not only for joining us today, but for speaking so personally to so many of us, and for all that you continue to do as a mental health advocate. This was extraordinary. We've been here 6 years, and each and every person that has been gracious enough to speak to us has touched our hearts, but I can't imagine anyone ever touching us the way that you did. Thank you very much, Andrew. Our final speaker today is someone who has devoted herself to advancing the mission of Columbia Psychiatry through her dedicated work on behalf of the department. Please join me in welcoming Laurie Rosenfeld, Chair of the Columbia Psychiatry Board of Directors. By the way, her son Trevor is here. I hope I'm not taking her words away. He's a wonderful golfer. He's played with my son. And, you know, the green jacket has got a future here in New York between the two of us, I'm sure of it.
On behalf of the Board of Advisors of Columbia Psychiatry, I would like to thank everyone here for attending the 6th Annual Gray Matters at Columbia Spring Benefit Luncheon. As many of you know, my involvement with Gray Matters began several years ago when profound psychiatric illness affected my family. My knowledge of the field at the time came from Google searches. These frequently pointed me to pharmaceutical drug websites, so I became well-versed in that department, but I remained naive about the sheer engulfing nature of mental illness, leaving me isolated and alone in the challenges my family faced. What I initially thought would be a tragic and defeating experience, however, has yielded numerous positive outcomes. I became integrated in a new community that aims to ameliorate the symptoms, find the causes, and mostly reduce the stigma of psychiatric disorders. These disorders are painful, often intractable, and if I could summon all my parental magic, I would stop them in the pre-nascent state. Columbia University and the New York State Psychiatric Institute is doing what I, as a mortal mother, am unable to do. But it takes a united community of people to realize our goals. Some members may be parents of children with illness, some may be relatives, doctors, or even those who have simply read about depression, for instance, in a magazine. In one way or another, a disorder or condition that is ineffably crippling has given the mother in all of us purpose, a new horizontal identity. In recognizing my child's horizontal identity, I have identified my own. Our backgrounds and reasons for our involvement in this cause may differ, but we all share the commitment to mental health advocacy. I believe that this commonality and dedication are why we have sold out this luncheon for the 2nd year in a row. If you have been moved by today's program, I urge you to stay engaged with us. To learn more about Columbia Psychiatry and Gray Matters at Columbia and how you can get involved, please speak with any of our committee members. We are all wearing badges, and we would love for you to join us. There are also cards and envelopes in the back of your program if you wish to contribute further to the research of the brilliant scientists working under Jeffrey Lieberman. You may take the cards with you or give them to the event staff at the registration table. Thank you all for coming. I hope this day has been as stimulating and as valuable to you as it always is to me.
All right, please join me in giving Andrew Solomon, Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman, Dr. Carolyn Rodriguez, Laurie Rosenfeld, and the Gray Matters at Columbia Fellows and the Benefit Committee for today's event a rousing round of applause. You're already there. Thank you for joining us today. I'm so glad you could be here, and I look forward to seeing you next year. Bye-bye.